Hello.
Good morning. Hey, thank you all for coming here for the third market value analysis of Jacksonville. I think for most of you in the room, you know exactly what you came for. So I won't get into what this all about. But I am very pleased to see such a critical mass of all of you engaged in, watching the dynamics of affordable housing and livelihoods here in the city. And we hope that this presentation gives you some additional food for thought. I am here as the president of the Jessie Ball duPont Fund, Mari Kurishi. We funded this study as we did the first two studies that were carried out here in Jacksonville. And I'm here to introduce the speakers, Ira Goldstein and Colin Weidig from the Reinvestment Fund. The Reinvestment Fund is based in Philadelphia, and it is a CDFI, also calls itself a community investment group, but it also has this really cool think tank side of the house. And Ira and Colin come from that side of the house. The MVA, the market value analysis, is a proprietary product of the Reinvestment Fund. And you will hear a lot about the methodology they employ, but we think this is incredibly valuable to understand the real dynamics of housing values here in the city. Ira is the president of Policy Solutions, and Colin works very closely with him and has been working on this project throughout. This is a hybrid meeting, so there are people online. For hello to people online, please keep yourself muted until we call on you. If you do have a question, please raise your hand. We will be monitoring the Zoom to see if anyone's raised their hands. For those of you in the room, because this is a hybrid meeting, please try to pick up a mic when you ask a question so that the people on Zoom can hear the question as well. And if for some reason you end up blurting out the question, we'll try to have the person who's answering it repeat the question so that there's a little clarity on the other side. Any other housekeeping notes? We're good? All right, in that case, I'm going to hand it over to Ira.
Thank you. Good morning, everybody. What a lovely town to be in. It's so beautiful coming out of Philadelphia's a little down this morning, as you can imagine. It's going to last a while, I got to say. That really stung. But you have Doug Peterson, so you have great future football, good wise. So anyway, good morning. I'm pleased today to walk through with you what we learned as part of the creation of this third market value analysis, or MVA, for the city of Jacksonville. Hang on one second. Yeah, as Maury said, we are a Philadelphia-based community development financial institution. I describe us, basically, for those not familiar with that body of organizations, we're a lending institution with a public purpose. So we lend money to create affordable housing and childcare centers and arts and culture spaces and charter schools and all the things that communities need to be vital, healthy, and equitable places. We also do, I think we distinguish ourselves from other CDFIs in that we do have this little think tanky kind of thing. I like to sort of think of us not only as a think, but sort of when you put us all together, we're a think and do tank, which allows us to use our knowledge and understanding of markets that we operate in and the partners that we operate with to be able to effectuate good things in a data-based way. So today you will hear from me, my colleague Colin, and then a relatively recent addition to our team who's stationed in our Atlanta office. We now have an office in Atlanta, Jessica Guarneros. I think this is your first full-blown start to finish MBA, is that right? So this is her inaugural MBA, and she's done a wonderful job with it. So quickly, what is an MBA? The MBA is a database, field validated take at what's going on in a community's real estate market. We gather an awful lot of objective, granular administrative data, and we do a number of things with it, which you'll see throughout the day today. But ultimately, the goal is to create an analytic and an understanding of a market so that people who are making investments, developing programs, creating regulations or intervention strategies have good sound data upon which to make those decisions. Moreover, because there is a spatial component, it allows you to think about where those particular intervention strategies can be most constructively targeted. So when we do this work, we are doing it all the way down to these little things called census block groups, which are about a fifth or a sixth the size of a census tract. And so you have an ability with your strategies to get really drilled in and localized about where you want them to take place. We've been doing MVAs now for over 20 years. Our very first one was created in the city of Philadelphia for now former Mayor John Street's Neighborhood Transformation Initiative. That was a $300 million set of investments in Philadelphia's people and neighborhoods, designed essentially to draw the vitality that he had recreated and that his predecessors had recreated in our downtown after decades and decades of doldrums. But his goal with this MVA and the $300 million worth of investments was to bring that up into the neighborhood so that everybody in Philadelphia could begin to benefit from that revitalization, as opposed to just those who were sitting in downtown Philadelphia. And I don't want to represent to you that every single thing that he did was great and perfect and impactful, but a lot of the things that he did were great and perfect and impactful. And communities saw investment that had never seen it before. They saw the delivery of programs. I know you don't worry so much about snowplows, but we do. And we had neighborhoods where you had generations of kids never saw a snowplow or, you know, with that kind of ground level intervention. And Mayor Street delivered those kinds of things. Not very sexy, but very impactful. So that's really what the MVA is for. We do these MVAs in communities around the country. Some of the ways that communities use them are in the creation of their consolidated plans associated with the Community Development Block Grant Program. You know, each community gets each year a truckload of money that is based on a formula of population and poverty and things like that. And so the requirements of that are that you have a plan. And HUD actually prefers if you have a database plan as to how and why you're going to make your expenditures the way you do them. People are using these MVAs in their assessments of fair housing to try and understand whether or not the observations that you have about disparities in places are driven by economics, are driven by race, or are driven by race and economics together. And that's a really important learning to come out of some of these things, because it helps you define the right strategy. Communities, one of my favorite uses is the Delaware State Housing Finance Agency, and they use their MVA, and we do a statewide one there. They use their MVA essentially to incent applications under the Low-Income Housing Tax Credit Program to go into certain places, and they do that by awarding points by market type. And so they have objectives about where they want LIHTC to go, LIHTC investments. Those LIHTC preferences are market-based, based on their MVA, and they add points. It doesn't mean that you can't get a LIHTC, and plenty of LIHTC applications are improved around the state that are not necessarily where the state wants them to go, but they do up the odds of getting it where they want it by using their MBA. And there's a whole host of other things that communities do, like targeted code enforcement, home ownership intervention strategies, things like that. So communities are every day trying to figure out different ways of using this market-based data. And I think that they're doing a terrific job with it. Just quickly before I turn it over to Colin, when we do this MBA, we do it for an entire city. And we do it for an entire city or county or state because we have these, what we call normative assumptions. In other words, it's sort of what's going on in the back of our mind as we initially created this MBA, and we think about having a tool that will be used in a set of ways. And the first one is that no matter how much public subsidy there is, and we're coming out of, I would say, probably an era of some of the richest amounts of public subsidy owing to sort of some COVID relief things that sort of supplemented or even were brand new funding streams. But they're not going to last forever, and they're never enough to do everything. So you need to think about those subsidies as a sort of a scarce resource and use them as a way not to create something where there wasn't necessarily something, but to think about ways of using that subsidy in a way of bringing forth the private market investment that is necessary really to have vital communities around the city. We also, you will see, as you've seen the last few times, a depiction of all the markets in Jacksonville. And they range from purple to like a salmonish color, right? I want to say very sort of explicitly, some people look at those maps and say, you know what, they look a little bit like those 1930s era redlining maps. So let's talk about that very explicitly. Those maps were designed to block investment. These maps are designed to bring investment. And that is a very fundamental different purpose. Moreover, in doing that, we have what we call a build from strength strategy. And that is not to avoid any particular place, but in going particularly in distressed markets. And every community has them. Think about what is the node of strength that you can invest into and build on so that you can lift up that whole area around it. And so these maps are not designed to keep you away from acting in places. They're designed to help you to make more constructive investments in a variety of places. And that is a fundamental difference, even though you'll see some similarities. And part of the reason you see some similarities is, you know what? Cutting off capital in the 1930s and having it effectively go on probably for 70, 80, some would argue till today, has a horrible manifest problem on communities and the residents of them. So that's why you'll see some overlap between those redlining maps and what you see today. But really important to be explicit about, these maps are designed not to block investment, but to help you target the investment. We also do this work for the entirety of a community, not just like a site where you want to do a housing development. And that's because when we think about stepping back and using this tool as a representative of the mayor or the federal government or the state government or a nonprofit or whatever you all are part of, we like to have a tool that can serve the entirety of the place, because everybody in this place, Jacksonville, is a customer for the goods and services and public amenities and the like that are available to you. And so you need the same metrics for everything, not just the site that you want to do your intervention. And lastly, and I think the fact that you are here, and some of you I recognize as having been here, multiple times through this wave of MBAs, and actually through prior MBAs, I think you all get that what was in the 2001 when we did the first one, what was a little bit of a controversial assumption that you ought to be making decisions based on data rather than other considerations. I think, the fact is the world has come around to believing that that is the right thing, even more so, and we want to give you something that helps you do that. Very quickly, how this is done, and this is the last before I turn it over to Colin. We gather, as I said earlier, a lot of administrative data. We prefer that over census data because it's more timely, it's more granular, and we actually think that it's more accurate. Not only do we get those data, and those come from city and county and other sources of that nature, and the city of Jacksonville has always been very helpful to us, as by the way, as the folks in the Schimberg Center who are fellow travelers in all this. We get those data and we actually physically inspect them to make sure they're accurate. And we think that that's a really important step, because no matter what kind of statistics you do on bad data, you can't really get anything good other than perhaps by random chance. So we want to make sure the data that goes into this is very, very clean. And we want to make sure that, to the extent possible, as we go through and clean that data, we give back the clean data, firstly. Secondly, we have groups, and you all have been part of, the validation process of seeing the stuff that we have, raising questions, giving us things to think about, sending us back into the neighborhoods because something looks amiss to you, or in some cases, even joining us as we validate it. And I appreciate that very much. And so all of that is part of that validation process. Once we're done and we think that the data are good, we then aggregate them up to these census block groups. Again, very small geographies. They're small enough that if we were to take, walk 6-8 blocks down Adams Street, we would observe several different conditions. With block groups, you would see that. With census tracts, it would just sort of represent the average of those places. And that's not what you need. You need the granularity. And then we subject it to a statistical cluster analysis. And what that does is, using all of the things that go into the MVA, it basically attaches them all to each of those geographies and statistically sorts them out into categories of places. And those categories of places essentially are defined by all of those indicia. But within each category, you see lots of similarity of places. Across those categories, we see differences, and you'll see differences in those places. So similarity within, difference across. We then, again, put it before our stakeholders. We subject it to more field validation. When it's done, we lock it down, and we begin to sort of look at some of the related issues that attach to the understanding of the market. So with that, I am going to stop and hand it over to my colleague Colin to walk through this 2022 MBA. Thanks.
Thanks, Ira. So now we're going to talk a little bit about the results of the current MBA. So this table represents the results of the current market value analysis. You can see on the left-hand side in that first column there were 9 market types identified by that statistical cluster analysis that Ira was describing. And then across the top, you'll see all the different components that went into the market value analysis. So we had things like the typical sale price and the variation in the sale price in a place. We had some measures of distress, like how much residential vacancy is there in an area, which was represented in this case by water shutoffs or low water usage activity, as well as foreclosure activity, looking at foreclosure filings, as well as the registry of bank-owned properties in an area. We have some measures of investment, like permit activity that's of $5,000 or more at a parcel level, so where people are really significantly reinvesting in their properties. And then there's some important other housing characteristics, like the mix of owners and renters in an area, the share of public subsidy that goes into an area, which are things like tax credit developments, housing choice vouchers, public housing, and finally, what the mix of the land use is in the area. So whether you see a neighborhood as predominantly residential, or there are a mix of things like commercial activity, maybe industrial activity. So the way you can use this table and the map that we'll look at in just a second is that you can literally put them right next to each other, and you can pick an area that you're interested in and go across one of those rows and understand what are the typical characteristics of this place based on the shade that you see on the map. So for example, if we wanted to look at an area that's that dark blue color, which is the B, which is 1, 2, 3 rows down, you'll see that it has sale prices that are a little bit above the typical across Duval County. Oh, and I should say on the bottom, you'll see a reference that says what the typical value is for all these different things across the county as a whole. And so for those B block groups, you'll see that the sale prices are a little bit above the typical value across the county. They have the lowest variance of sales price. And what that means is that properties are generally selling for about the same amount. You don't see wide disparities in what properties are selling for in those areas. Very low distress in terms of you'll see very few residential vacant properties in those areas, as well as few foreclosure filings or those bank registered vacant properties. High share of home ownership, low public subsidy, predominantly residential uses, and higher than average share of reinvestment activity in those areas. And so when you take that table and you look at any of those dark shaded blue areas across Duval County, you're going to know that those are the characteristics of all those places. Even if you're looking at a dark blue that's sort of in the western part of the county, that's by that Crystal Springs label, or down in the south by Del Rio, or way out in East Arlington, even though those are very geographically distinct parts of Jacksonville, those places have really similar housing characteristics along that whole set of things that goes into the table. And so when you're looking at a particular area, and we're going to zoom in now a little bit to downtown and the surrounding area, you can identify both what the typical characteristics are in a particular place that you might be interested in, but you might also want to look at some of the places around it, because as Ira mentioned, as you sort of just walk across many of these places, you're going to see a real variety of colors in a short area. And that means that you'll see very different market conditions as you just move from block group to block group. So when you're thinking about working in a particular place, you really want to identify with that table, what are the typical characteristics in this place? How much vacancy do we see? How much reinvestment are people already doing in the area? And then also, what's going on in the areas around it? And are there those nodes of strength that we can build off of when we're doing our work? I'm going to break it down the clusters a little bit more so you can see how the statistical cluster analysis is distinguishing the different groups from each other. These are the purple and blue market types. You'll see that the purple areas are along the river and out by the beaches, and those are the areas that have the highest sale prices. There are also areas that are getting the highest concentration of reinvestment activity in terms of people putting permitted activity back into their homes in those areas. The blue block groups have similar sale prices and also are highly homeowner occupied. There aren't that many renters in these places. They're also getting higher than average permitting activity. But you can see that what distinguishes these two is that in those lighter blue shades, there's much lower residential land use. So those are places that you might be more likely to see some farmland or some industrial activity or something besides just residential activity. Our next set here, these green and yellow block groups, are your middle markets. And the E market in particular, you'll see has 134 block groups. So this is the most common category across Jacksonville. And these are places that have sale prices somewhere around maybe a little bit below the typical sale price for the county. But they're really strong places in terms of they have a good share of home ownership. There's permitting activity going back into these places. There's low share of public subsidy. The D or green areas are the first cluster that we see that really has a high share of renters. And so these are places where the sale prices are strong, but you're going to see that there's lots of maybe multifamily developments in those places as opposed to some of those first areas that we looked at. And then finally, for the middle markets, you'll see that dark shade of yellow. And these are areas where you'll see high numbers of tax credit developments or other shares of public subsidy. And you'll see that on there are almost 75% of rental units in that area. Those areas have some form of subsidy going to them. Then finally, these are the orange and salmon markets. The orange markets have lower than typical sale prices. And what really distinguishes them from some of the other areas is that you still see some foreclosure activity that's a little bit higher than other parts of the county. So that's both foreclosure filings, but you might also see some of those bank-owned properties still in these areas. And we'll show in a little bit that foreclosure in general has really been going down over the time period that we've done these analyses. But those orange areas are those where you might still see some of the leftovers of the foreclosure activity that happened over the past decade. And then the salmon block groups, you'll see that the light salmon color also has a high share of public subsidies. So you might see public housing developments, tax credit developments in those places. And the darkest shade of salmon is that where you'll see the highest share of residential vacancy. So having looked at the current MVA, this is our third MVA, so we can look back a little bit over time and see how have markets been changing across Jacksonville over the past, say, 3 years from the last MVA, and then 6 or 7 years for the past 2 MVAs. So this is the map of the current MVA, and those shadings that you see hatched over different areas show whether an area has been sort of moving up in those color groupings or whether it's declined. The blue indicates that an area has moved up one of the color groupings, and a red shading indicates that an area might have moved down a little bit. If you look at the legend, you'll see that almost 1/3 of the block groups across Jacksonville have moved up in the color grouping since 2018. So there's been a lot of areas that have really seen strengthening in the residential real estate market in the past 4 years. And you'll also see geographically, they're really all over the county. And so you have a whole bunch of different places that have been able to sort of move up in the time period since we did the last MBA. If we look a little bit longer to the first MBA, now we're up to almost half of the block groups across the county have been moving up in that time period. And again, you see a lot of geographic diversity in the parts of the county where you see that activity. There's just a handful of places that have declined, and they seem to be just sort of scattered randomly throughout the county. So this is sale price change since the last market value analysis. And I want to just direct your eye to the legend because you'll probably see a lot of that middle beige color, but that color represents 25 to 50% sale price increase because we've seen such large sale price increases in the time period since the last market value analysis. That's about a typical sale price increase for a block group throughout the county. And for the darkest shaded areas, you're talking about sale prices doubling or even more in just the 4 years since we last did this analysis. You see those concentrations of those largest doubling or more activities are mostly in and around the downtown area. And then you'll see a few scattered places throughout that also have that sale price increase. And notably, there's really few places that have seen any sale price decline in this period. If we look a little bit further out, you see an even greater increase in the geography of where sale prices have been increasing. You're going to start seeing that in the south and west part of Jacksonville, those darkest shaded areas with doubling or more of sale price, as well as out into Arlington and places as you go east. So there's really been dramatic sale price increases in the time we've been doing this work. If you look a little bit closer, you can see how many of those areas are in and around the downtown. Just sort of all over on this map, you see many places that have experienced a doubling or more of sale price in a time in less than a decade that we've been doing this work. This map shows change in home ownership since the first market value analysis. You'll see the strongest increases in where we see homestead exemptions are in the area outside of the 295 corridor. And you'll see those mostly in the west and the northern part of the county, but you also see many parts on Riverside or out towards East Arlington where we've seen really big increases in the share of folks that have homestead exemptions, so are homeowners. But there's one really notable exception to that, which is north and west of downtown and a little bit on east side. You'll see those areas haven't experienced the same increase in home ownership that you see generally throughout Jacksonville. One positive change in those areas, though, is that residential vacancy has really declined by quite a lot in those areas since we've been doing this work. And so the map colors are kind of flipped here, where the darker shades represent a greater decrease in residential vacancy. And you'll see from Allendale to Brentwood to Springfield and Eastside that there's been big decreases in residential vacancy since the first market value analysis. Finally, as I mentioned a little bit earlier, there's been just a general decrease in foreclosure activity across the board. And you see some of those places there's been 20% or less change in the share of homes that experience a foreclosure filing, and a big decrease in those bank-owned vacant properties that are on the registry. And that's really happened in all parts of the city. This table summarizes some of those changes by the different market types that we looked at earlier. The orange and salmon markets are the places where you're seeing that doubling in sale price since the last market value analysis. The typical block group in those areas has had 100% more change in sale price in just 4 or 5 years. In terms of where permitting activity is going, you see quite a bit increase in the purple and the dark blue markets. But you also see a big increase in those E markets, which are the most common markets. So those are your really core middle market homeownership market, and you're seeing a big increase in people who are willing to reinvest in their property across the county. The share of distress in terms of vacancy represented by water shutoffs and foreclosure is decreasing fastest in those G, H, and I markets. So I think that's a really good story that you're seeing less distress in those places, and that's probably part of why you're seeing such a strong sale price increase in those areas as well. And then finally, as we saw on the maps, you see that generally homeownership has gone up by quite a bit in each of those different market types, but there is the exception of especially those H and I markets, where you're starting to see in the I markets, especially a decline in homeownership. So that's the current market value analysis and some of the changes we've seen over time. I'm going to pass it back to Ira, who's going to talk about some critical themes and some of the learnings from this particular analysis.
I'm breaking the technology again. Sorry about that. Okay, so some of the themes, affordability. You know, the rising prices are a double-edged sword. On the one hand, people who have homes have greater value, their asset is worth more, and that's a terrific thing. On the other hand, people who don't have homes may find it harder and harder to get into different parts of Jacksonville. So what we do is we take a look at typical income in the city, which is about, I think, 56,000 or so. And then we say, okay, so if you earn that amount of money, or different thresholds that will show you, you can generally afford about 3 times your annual income in a home sale price. Some might push it to 4, some people feel a little bit less than 3. We go with 3 as just sort of a benchmark. This particular map, what you're seeing is the contemporary MVA, which is what the colors you see, and you see a masking of places where if you earn about 120% of AMI, you cannot get in. So any of those gray places are financially unavailable to you, or they're just beyond what you can reach in an affordable way. So at 120% of AMI, which is about $68,000, $66,000, something of that level, what you'll see is you can find your way into what amounts to just a few of those middle market areas. And obviously you could afford some of those more stressed markets. And when I say the middle market areas, again, I'm pointing out some of the blues and greens as the places that would be available to you. On the other hand, if you make just 100%, look how little is available to you. All that sort of middle market goes away. Now that is for typical income households here. And Chris is going to go into some discussion about who those households are and what they look like later on this morning. But this is telling you if you are typical in the county, the space that's available to you affordably is very narrow. Now, not everybody is able to make $56,000. Some are now at 80% of median. And look what's left for you. Just some of the most distressed parts, or you have to go way out there, you know, in the far reaches of the county. And you all know better than us, but we do have a feel for how long it takes to get from the far southwest of Jacksonville to, you know, perhaps to downtown for work. And then at 50% of median, Yeah, right. This is working. Let me see if I can get it to. There we go. 50% is not all that much. One way to think about this, and the phrase that I like to use for this analysis is it's the geography of opportunity. If we think that these different markets are not only about the housing markets, but what they offer to people in terms of access to schools and parks and rec centers and libraries and all the other things that go with space. If you make half of median income, your geography of opportunity is very, very constrained here in Jacksonville. Now, how did it change? This is if we were to look at the 2018 income, and this tells you what came offline just in the last couple of years. Any of those blue hatched areas on average is what came off of line. And one of the other features is not everybody earns the same. And so we know that incomes for white families and Black families and Hispanic families is different. And there's a lot of reasons for that, right? What this tells you is if you look at Jacksonville through the eyes of a typical white family, which earns about $65,000, this is what's available to you. Some of the middle markets and different kinds of places are available to you, and certainly some of the more stressed markets are. But if you look at Jacksonville through the eyes of a typical Black family, look at the difference in that geography of opportunity. And this is the average, right? It's the typical family, white, Black. Look how much comes off. And Hispanic incomes are a little bit higher than Black incomes in this community. And so their geography of opportunity opens up just a little bit, but not nearly as much as it is for white. Not only that, I think Colin showed you some really interesting slides that showed you what's going on, particularly in those H&I markets as it relates to home prices and as it relates to home ownership. A lot of those H&I markets are right in here where we're showing you the zoom in, right? This particular map represents where there is increasing what we call displacement pressure, which is an index that we create using home sale prices over time and incomes over time. So when that ratio rises, it means it's more unaffordable to people, and perhaps even people who are there might find it difficult to hang in, right? So any place on here that has a dark brown shading or dark umber shading, whatever that color is, what you'll find is those are the places where the displacement pressure is greatest. And what you're seeing is in some of these places, these are the places that at this moment, frankly, are currently available to people who are of modest means, but likely won't be the next time if we're fortunate to come back and do this again. And here what we do is we put together the MVA and that displacement risk ratio. And this, I think, is a really important map for you all to think about. We categorize the MVA into, let's say, strong and middle and more stressed markets, the way Colin talked about it. And then we look at that displacement risk ratio over time. The colors to pay most attention to here, I think, for purposes of intervention strategies, are those dark teal colors and those orangish umberish colors, okay? Why? The dark teal colors, those are representing places that are either in that middle or stressed market range, but are under lots of pressure. These are the places where intervention strategies, preservation strategies to be able to hold people in place so that as that community is changing, they're able to take advantage of the upward lift of that community. That's where I'd be focusing activity. Yes, sir. If you'd like, sure. It would typically be that we didn't have a sufficiency of sale prices to be able to make the estimation. And in this particular instance, we got to look over a period of time. So it would typically be sale prices. There could be one or another thing, but that would be about it. Not enough transactions. We like to have enough to have a stable estimate. Yes. Oh, I'm sorry. The question was, on this particular map, there are a few places where we have insufficient data. And why is that? And that would typically be where we just don't have enough sales in a particular window of time to be able to make the estimation. So those teal color places, I'd pay a lot of attention to those, particularly if you are in the business of the kinds of intervention strategies that are designed to help people stay in place, right? And to enhance affordability in places where that affordability is diminishing. First thing. Then you got the umberish places. And those are the places where what you worry is, it's not like a high, quickly rising price displacement. It's more like those places aren't keeping up. And you're starting to see stressors in those places. And the question is, can you intervene in those places in such a way, in a constructive way, so that those stressors are removed and those places, you know, sort of more keep up with it? Because if you don't, then people who have the wherewithal to leave will leave. And those who don't will stay. And the problem is they're staying in a place that is not keeping up. It could be that it's suffering from a lack of investment, the housing conditions are bad, you know, it could be a variety of different other things. But herein, these are places to go in and sort of think about intervention strategies that are arresting decline, right? As opposed to sort of harnessing that market in the dark teal and trying to figure out how to hold on to that affordability. Now I'm going to stop and turn it over to my colleague Jessica, because one of the things that we'd identified here, actually in the first MVA, but didn't exactly know what we were looking at until more recently, was the impact of the penetration of private investors in the market. So let me stop here.
This working?
Yes.
All right, awesome. All right, so like Iris said, I'm going to go over some of the investor activity that's been happening in the home market since 2020. All right, so in this map here, you can see what this is showing is investor activity. So either the purchaser or the buyer was an investor. The blue dots are showing for-profit investors, and the pink dots are showing nonprofit investors. So you can see kind of a little concentration of the nonprofit investors happening in the downtown area. And that's like Habijacks and other organizations like that. And you can also see that a lot of this investment activity is completely blacking out the lower markets. It's not really blacking out the purple or the blue markets that you can see right here. And then this here is showing the current ownership of properties owned either by nonprofit or for-profit investors. You can see it's throughout the county, wherever there's residential space, that's where for-profit and nonprofit investors are owning properties at this current time. And again, you can see a concentration of nonprofit investors in the downtown area, a little bit scattered towards the beach and down towards the Southwood County. All right, so we looked at some statistics regarding the investor activity since 2020 in the different types of markets. So this first column here, I'll draw your attention to, is highlighted in red. These are share of sales from owners to owners. You can see at the higher markets, 67% right here of sales are occurring between homeowners to other homeowners. When you get all the way down to our I market, our salmon market, 17%. So way lower ownership going on there. And then you can also see in this middle column here, share of sales from non-investor to investors, so from homeowners to investors. So these are where places are losing home ownership. It's double in the I market than what you're seeing in the higher markets, the A through D markets right there. Right. And then these next columns here are also showing shares of sales from investors to non-investors. So where investors are selling to homeowners. You can see in the C market, we got kind of a peak right there. 44% of those sales are happening. And that's kind of where we're seeing new construction happening. So investors, as developers selling to new homeowners right there. And then in this last column here are investors to investors. Again, you're seeing a much higher share from investors selling to other investors in the lower markets. All right, we're going to pass it back off to Colin. Ira?
Okay, I'll be brief. This looks at where credit is found. So this is based on mortgage data for the entirety of the study area. It is mortgage data that covers the period 2021. It's as close in time as we could get it to match with the other data in the MBA. We've generalized some of the markets because the mortgage data are available only at a census tract level as opposed to a block group level. So that's the only way to get these things to match up. One of the things that you will notice, probably not all that surprising to you because you're all people who sort of understand what's going on in your place, is that mortgages tend not to be equally available across space. And what you see, whether or not you look at the origination rates being substantially higher in those purple markets than they are in the salmon markets, or in the denial rates, which are 2+ times higher in those salmon markets than they are in the purple markets, that is, I think, probably consistent with what you know about your place. But I want to draw your attention to this one line on the slide that looks at essentially the total number of sales that exist within a place, and then what percentage of those sales are associated with the mortgage. In other words, they're cash transactions, as best as we can know. Now, it's not a perfect estimation, but it's as good as we can know at this moment. And what you'll see is in the stronger markets, the overwhelming majority of those sales that exist in those places are people buying with mortgages. But if you go into those orange and salmon markets, what you'll find is that only 3 in 10 of the home sales over the particular period that we're matching these data up for had a mortgage associated with them. That's not low income people buying houses with cash, right? I think that what it does is it sort of emphasizes the importance of that map that Jessica showed you a few moments ago that showed you where the investor activity was really predominant. And one of the things I would like to say is we've shown you a slide sort of like this from some of the previous MBAs that looked at the equality that mortgage dollars get across the different MBA market types. But we didn't exactly know what we were looking at until we started to see those investor sales and to see those percentages of sales without mortgages. I think it's really important with all of the sort of public discourse around the importance of investors going into markets and making investments in markets. And, that the Southeast, like a place like Jacksonville, is a very hot investor market. We know that there's positives of investment, and we know that there's negatives as well. And so we thought it was important to be able to sort of drill in and see where these things are happening. And what we observe, and what's not part of the public discourse, but I think is really important for you all to think about, if you will, is to sort of think about that investment activity does not happen equally across the markets of Jacksonville. And in fact, it's very much concentrated in those orange and salmon markets. And where Colin showed you that slide where you saw the declining home ownership, and Jessica showed you that slide with all of those pox on the map, that, with all that activity. What it's saying is we have some concerns here that in some of your more stressed markets, that home ownership opportunities are going away, and homeowners may be losing what they have. And what's happening is that housing stock is being replaced, whereas at one time it was ownership stock, it's now renter stock. Same population in a way, but a different tenure, which is not going to be positive for the long-term prospects of generating wealth through one's home. So with that, I think we are done, and we're going to turn it over to Chris, you want to do some? Oh, okay.
Like so the folks on Zoom can hear.
Thank you. The map that was showing the investor investment here, it occurred when I was looking at this and the next map. Is there a way for us to understand which parcels may actually be being purchased by individuals for their residents with subsidy supporting their purchase, down payment assistance, for instance?
I think you probably could with data that's available at the city. We don't have those data. But, you know, like in Philadelphia, we have a first-time home buyer program. Several thousand people went through it. We are able to see that sort of coincidence in home sales and who gets the subsidy and that kind of thing. We don't have these data for Jacksonville, but if the city has them, that would be a really important thing. I think, particularly as you think about perhaps, let me see if I get to it in this map right here, because if you are able to help people with that down payment and closing cost assistance, perhaps to make their way, sort of more modest income people, to make their way into some of those darker teal markets, what you're doing is essentially saying, with a little bit of help, you are going to be able to sort of get into a market that is really rising in a positive way. So I do think that that would be a really neat analytic thing for you all to do. And if your city has those data, you can absolutely match them up. Yes, ma'am.
I have two questions for you. On one of the charts, you were giving the number of rental units in comparison to other items. How do you determine if a unit is rental?
So it is an imperfect, but Jacksonville is actually one of the few places around the country where we have any administrative record that we can rely on, and that's through those homestead exemptions. So in many communities, the records are vastly imperfect. We have to sort of think about using things like, where does the tax bill go? It never works out well, and we end up using American Community Survey or Postal Service data. We actually looked at those things here as part of our process, and we settled on that homestead exemption as being more valid representation.
Okay, so it wouldn't really pull out if a household was owner occupied but not homestead exempted, or it was a second home that wasn't, but it's not a rental.
Yes, if it does not, that's right.
Okay. The other question I had was on the investors. You were saying, is there a way to differentiate between properties that are bought by home builders to build a home and sell, so we can track who the ultimate owner is? Investors who are buying completed stock and either owning or renting them.
Yeah, Airbnb is a different question, but let's talk about the, knowing who's buying them. Again, Jacksonville's property transaction records are pretty good, particularly compared to some other places, like, for example, the state of Texas, where you can almost get nothing, right? So you have really good data that would allow you to look at that. And it's a matter of understanding, when you look at buyer and seller, who those buyers are and who those sellers are. And you can, what we basically did is we went row by row through those data. We applied some algorithms that pulled out LLCs, and we then we sent out lists to some people in this stakeholder group to help us identify who the nonprofits were. So that's how you were able to see those differentiated dots. But it really is sort of a manual process of going through and doing that. But that's the way you do it. And, I think that the investor discussion has gotten, it hasn't had the level of nuance that it really needs to have. And I do think the kinds of analytics that you're talking about are really the proper ones. I mean, let's sort of be real about it. Every renter occupied house in the history of our country is owned by an investor. Now, it's not whether or not that investor owns, the other side of their duplex or 10,000 units. I mean, obviously there's a difference there. Now, we've become really sort of attuned to it, because I think you're seeing a little bit of a change in the nature of who investors are and the size of their portfolios and what they do with their portfolios and things like that. And I think that we've gotten sort of taken by, let's carve the world into good and bad, and that's really simple. But I think that there really needs to be a lot more nuance to that investor discussion. And because there's so much of it here, it becomes the right place to add that level of nuance. And what you talk about as an analytic is the right way to do it.
Hi, I'm curious on the investor question, to get to your nuance comment, whether or not you're able to look at qualified versus unqualified sales. And if so, did that contribute to the categorization of stable weak markets and lagging weak markets? In other words, the higher the unqualified sales, then that contributed to the depressed home values in those particular areas.
I'm going to see if I could pitch that to Colin, because he's the one, and Jessica, they trolled through the data one by one. So let me ask them to answer. So for people on the other side of the room, Colin's answer to that question was that we use the appraiser data here, and it's very good data. And we did not scan for that particular code, but we could actually look at the share of sales that are qualified or unqualified, and then sort of link them up to market types. And let me just say also, the Jessie Ball duPont Fund has been extraordinary over the years in terms of sort of pushing us and allowing us to be able to distribute and redistribute the data. And all of these data will go to wherever you want them to go, including sitting in the city's coffers, pushing it out on some public website, whatever you want, we will do. The data, come from here and they go back to here. So that is the goal, so that you can use it, not just in a static deck like this. Yes, ma'am.
Thanks. Did you do a comparison between where the incentives are for building residential and whether they're working? For instance, empowerment zones all along Phillips Highway.
Yeah, no, we have not. And again, that is certainly an overlay that we could do to see, you could almost envision going back to the MVA map. Let's post. You could envision sort of identifying where those zones are and sort of creating carve-outs on that, and essentially seeing how those market types have changed over time. It certainly is doable, particularly if they have well-defined footprints. Yep, then we absolutely could do it, but we did not do it as part of this. Other questions? Yeah, because I would like to sort of just stop on this investor thing just a little bit. Again, you all have some really extraordinary stuff going on here, which is a little bit different than we see in other places. And I do think that this Jacksonville community is a place where you could really dig into it and understand a little more, because there is so much of it going on. And to be able to figure out that which is helpful and constructive, that which maybe meets an investor's need, and that which meets a community's need. And I think, again, that is the kind of nuance that you need to add to this. Where is it not just a profitable endeavor, but where is it a constructive endeavor for the beneficiaries and the communities that sort of are the home to it? And again, I think you have an opportunity to do that here because you have so much of it. Well, all of you, I know there's more to the program this morning, but I did want to thank all of you. Virtually all of you are very familiar faces to me, and I want to thank you for sort of being on this journey with us over the last several months, and sitting on calls and coming to this this beautiful room here, being part of the discussion, going out in the field with us, some of you, and helping us hopefully make sure that what we turn back to you is a very accurate depiction of the Jacksonville market, as well as a depiction that is not only accurate but actionable, so you can do something with this and really improve the prospects of the neighborhoods and the residents.
Ira, before you go off the stage, could you double click on what you said about Jacksonville being extraordinary in terms of the nuances of the investor? Because I think it could mean different things to different people.
Yeah. Well, It's extraordinary in a couple different ways. Firstly, in terms of its activity in the single family home market. When you compare Jacksonville to other communities around the country, it's very high as a, as a share of activity. And, it's very high in the Southeast in general. Jacksonville is, every time you see a list, you see that Jacksonville is high on the list. But you also have a variety of different things that I think are worth really digging at a little bit. You have a reasonably active nonprofit developer side and investor side. And so where are they going? What are they accomplishing? Who is benefiting? And when I say who, I mean not only people, but place, and is that working the way you need it to work? On the private investor side, we saw this all the way back that, you always had like your BlackRocks and the like that were very active, like along the beaches. They like those high priced homes. It is their market. But you also have like a big middle, as Colin showed you there, in terms of those markets. And, I think that there's really just an equation that investors make between how much housing costs to either acquire and rehabilitate and what you can get in the way of rents, right? I mean, if you look at it just from the perspective of the business person. So if you can pick up a house for 120,000 or 100,000 and put 20 or 30 or 40,000 into it and make it livable and good, you can make a really good living doing that with the fair market rents, given what they are these days. That's actually not necessarily a bad thing, right? But you also have within the sort of the large space of the investment community, some for whom that's not necessarily the business objective. And one of the things that Jessica didn't point out, but I think is really an important part of this, there is, hang on one second, I'm sorry if I'm making people, particularly online, a little seasick going through these maps. This one right here. That next to last column, that's share of sales from investors to investors. So that's investors swapping portfolios essentially. And that is, if you look at where that's happening, almost 40% of the sales in H&I markets are going from one investor to another. Now, again, that could be a good thing, or it could be a not good thing. We have actually a borrower of ours in the Baltimore area, and his business model is to buy investment portfolios from investors who are not doing a particularly good job with them, buying them, fixing them up, and putting them back into service. That's kind of a good thing. But if you have, an ecology of investors who are buying one from the next, each one just extracting more value and giving people a less good living situation, that's a bad thing. So that's where you need that nuance, right? And that's, I think, where it's both sort of that kind of analytic that you're talking about. It's probably also connected to sort of looking at building permitting activity. So are homes being improved? I think it's looking at code enforcement activities. Are you seeing just a tidal wave of code enforcement issues where you're seeing these, swapped portfolios of investor to investor? These are all questions, and the answers to which help you sort of better understand whether or not you're getting constructive investment activity as opposed to more extractive investor activity. And that's kind of what I'm meaning. Oh, I'm sorry. Unfortunately, I can't because I don't, that's not a geography that we work with, but we can actually, we will create, I'm going to say it on behalf of Colin and Jessica, we can create a map that has a zip code overlay for you. Just literally put down the sort of boundaries of those puzzle pieces right on top of the map. That absolutely can be done. And it's done really well because it's perfect, but really well because the block groups are really small. And so you'll have a little bit of slop at the edges sometimes, but it's really small. Yeah. I think that's a pretty quickie thing to do. Yeah. Colin's shaking his head and sticking pins in a doll at the same time. Yes, sir.
So we have a lot of doers in the room, right? A lot of folks who want to do something with the information, right? Most of us are in that case. And so I love to hear feedback from you on the best case scenarios in other cities that you guys have worked with. What are some of the case studies maybe on who takes this information the best and utilizes it? You've mentioned some things, good questions to ask, but I'm just curious, some of us work in a lot of those H&I communities and communities outside of those as well, but what do the best cities do with the information to best utilize the MVA to create appropriate change, improve home ownership numbers, et cetera? Any examples you can give us for potential next steps?
Yeah, let me give you a couple of examples. A couple of years ago, I thought the city of Pittsburgh came together, and I'm not sure if it's still active to this day, but a couple of years ago, and we've been doing MVAs in Pittsburgh every few years, going back to probably about 2005 or 8 or something like that. The philanthropic community and the community development community and a select group of others came together and essentially created some set of agreements around where they were going to subsidize and to what degree and to what end, connected to a couple of different things, but a big driver was those MVA market types. And so, depending upon what particular vehicle they were talking about, whether or not it was philanthropic vehicle or a federal vehicle or a vehicle, I mean, an investment tool, or municipal money, city money, they would sort of look at the different market types and sort of create literally a grid of, what they wanted to be their sort of desired mix of those things in the different market types. I thought that was, a really extraordinary thing. And you all have a community of people who sort of, look at these things and care about these things and want to invest in them and make them stronger. And, one of the things I would point out is, the H and the I markets, prices have gone up. But the challenge is some of the other things that that make them H and I markets have not necessarily improved. And so you saw lots of code enforcement issues. You saw declining home ownership. You saw a variety of other kinds of things like that, which, quite frankly, if you were to sort of take those things and really just carve into those adverse market conditions that are there, you could really change those places pretty dramatically. And the goal ultimately, I think no matter what, you'll always have a range of prices showing in your market. But what you really don't like to see is that along with those prices are these adverse things like physical problems in the neighborhoods or vacancies or lack of investment or a vastly disproportionate mix of homeowners who are buying and selling and investors who are buying and selling. So I do think, sort of digging into some of the things that are the challenges in those H&I markets, and you see them not on this table, but on the other table that shows you those categories. That's one of the things that I think would be a good, good place to start for sure. Because, not everybody's going to make $150,000, $200,000, $300,000. And so you need a market that has an array of prices for people, but they need to be decent places and not subject from no investment, high vacancy, poor physical condition, et cetera. That's not right. So that's where I think, focus on some of those things. I would say, yeah, it probably is due to investor activity, and it's hard. Like for me, a chicken and egg problem is if people are sort of, at the, let's say 80% of middle income, if they're looking to become homeowners, their ability to get into what was formerly a middle market, that is really a challenge for them. So it puts increasing pressure on those housing markets in the H&I, also driving up those prices. So, Yeah, the price issue is really a complication, but I do think being able to, first of all, the prices, and let me go back to it. I don't, excuse me, sorry. I just want to go back to that early MVA table. Here we go. You know, those prices at that 65 to 58,000 or so, obviously there's variance around those prices. But those are actual transaction prices. Now I can tell you, we're also simultaneously working in Nashville. They don't really have markets that look, put price aside, physically like some of your H&I markets. You don't have the abandonment, or you don't have the poor physical condition in their market that you see in Jacksonville's H&I. But you also have a price spectrum that bottoms out at the $80,000 range, roughly speaking. And so, like, I don't know what regular people do there. Here, there are some opportunities for people who are in that 50, 80. It's constrained, and they're not necessarily advantageous, but if they could be made more advantageous, so you're not seeing those shutoffs, you're not seeing foreclosures, you're not seeing a lack of permitting activity. So you're seeing evidence of positive investment going into those places. It's great that you have that lower price piece that other places don't have, but it's a challenge because the lower price is going with, and you know, in some of those places, lower quality. And up that quality, that would be terrific, right? Because then you make for a viable place for somebody of modest means.
Awesome, thank you. Really want to appreciate or say thank you to Ira, Colin, and Jessica for making the trip down. I feel for the Eagles. I was pulling for them myself. So usually with the MVAs, we're doing something a little bit different this year. We would receive this great information, outstanding data, and then we'd get a list of 7 or 8 things that we could be doing. Right? Here's your homework if you want to, and go out and do better. But what we noticed, and Katie, again, I wanted to shout out to Katie. She's led this work over the first 2 MBAs and is wrapping up with this one. What we were having a conversation, it was like, we always have homework to do. There's always the things that we aren't doing, but we've got, this is our 3rd one. We've got trends, we've got understanding. And to Ira's point about the reticence to use data and evidence to make decisions, we really do feel like we're starting to make a transition here. So what we wanted to do this time is really talk about what's going on. What are we doing using the MVA as a basis, using the work the Jessie Ball duPont Fund has done with CDFI Friendly over the last 18 months. And this is really just from the duPont Fund's perspective, right? We've been a participant and advocate. We've been a spectator and sometimes a pot stirrer in the affordable housing space for a decade since I've been here. So really what we wanted to do this time is kind of zero in this year, and let's talk about what is got the potential, what's in the pipeline, but how could we move the needle this year? One, to be aware of these 4 initiatives. I'm not going to take a lot of time, and we're not going to go deep. This is kind of an introduction. Some of you may know. But what's the opportunity? 1, if we're aware of what's going on, and 2, if there's opportunity to collaborate and kind of catalyze some of this work. I wanted to start, am I holding this the right way? Probably not. Okay, we wanted to start here with just strapping the data and information that you heard to real people, right? So this is Duval County. And it starts with a range of folks. On the left here, we have an example of an adult on disability insurance, all the way up to a first-year police officer, in comparison to median household income, which was $56,769. So just take a minute and kind of look across the spectrum of folks that we care about, that we want to be able to remain in our community. We don't want, based on the data and the trajectory that we've seen over the last 3 MVAs and that shrinking areas of opportunity that Ira pointed out, for those, whether you're based on annual income. These are the folks who are going to have to go outside the county to try and find homes if they want to work in Jacksonville, if we don't have an intervention. And this will be shared. So let's talk about moving the needle. And again, this is really under the frame of equitable access to housing. We're not necessarily going to use, the affordable housing, workforce housing. Let's just talk about equitable access and how do we need to build the ecosystem so that equity can, oops, did I get ahead of myself? Oh yeah. So that we can be more equitable in the decisions we make and our investments. How does this keep moving? Yeah, don't do that. Thank you, love. Okay, we're ghosting. Okay, so, so basically, if you think about three things that could happen to be more equitable, one, we need to increase housing stock, and we need to focus on emphasizing long-term affordability, right? Stabilizing and protecting homeowners. And then as we do that, how do we minimize displacement? So there's a few considerations and a frame that we just want to use. And again, this is from our perspective. This is how we think about it. So the first consideration is placement. So deciding where we're going to focus our development. So tools like the MBA is very helpful in helping to think about which areas we can build strength, right? How do we place our investment? We have opportunities to support our friends here that are working in CDCs and CHODOs that are neighborhood-based, right? So we can get to place-based investment. Second consideration is preservation. How do we preserve and maintain affordability for the housing that already exists? Third consideration, production. Obviously, there's a scarcity of units. So how do we create new housing, but how do we create it so that everyone in Jacksonville has an opportunity to live in it? And then lastly, protection. How do we protect and stabilize homeowners? So using these considerations, here's it all wrapped up. There are four things we just wanted to point out that's either starting or ongoing in 2023. So we're going to briefly just touch on the Community Land Trust, the Jackson Affordable Housing Fund, CDCs and CHODO capacity, and then heirs property. So first, I know many people in this room, I've seen your faces when we talked about the Community Land Trust. We're not going to go deep into each of these, but again, the focus of the Community Land Trust was that this is to focus on permanently affordable housing, which is something that, again, tax credits are great and they help to facilitate affordable housing, but oftentimes they're limited in duration. And those affordable units can flip to market rate once the tax credits run out. Community Land Trust focus on permanent affordability. It was the #1 recommendation that came out of the 2019 Jacks Housing Summit. So the community got together, said, this is something that we could focus on. And the good news, it was launched and staffed in 2022. So we are starting to move forward with the CLT now. The highlight, I think, one that came out of this and where Jacksonville, I think, has something that can pat itself on the back for, was being able to pass the first right of refusal legislation. And the goal, based on one of their presentations I saw recently, they're hoping to be able to turn 19 houses in the first 2, or 19 homes in the first 2 years, make those affordable for new homeowners. The second is something that y'all might not know about, but we want you to be aware of it because this is something that's in progress, right? So it's a Jack's Affordable Housing Fund is a proposed name for it. Based on the CDFI friendly work and some of the work we've facilitated around affordable housing, we noticed that there were 2 significant gaps in the housing capital stack that most of our developers were facing, especially if you're trying to make affordable housing pencil out, right? So acquisition capital and likely the long-term mezz debt. How do we take some of those 4% tax credits off the sideline and figure out a financing mechanism to capitalize on them and move those forward? This was the #1 recommendation that came out of the December meeting for the 2022 Jacks Housing Summit. And we've been working with self-help venture funds. And this is a model that's based in Durham, North Carolina that's already active, but it mirrors the needs that we've heard in the community. So the idea here is that if possible, and we're having conversations with the city now to see if we can get a line item in the budget before June and the administration's turnover, creating a public-private partnership for a $40 million affordable housing fund. And that would be public money as well as private collaboration. The good news is if you come in on the private side, it's an impact investment. You would see a return of your capital. Again, I think the highlight is it's long-term. We're proposing 15 years. So it's not something that's going to wrap up after 5, but a 15-year public-private partnership that recycles the capital. And again, I think the goal is between 500 and 1,000 units, but that 40 million has the potential to leverage 160 million over the 15 years. The third strategy, CHODO and CD capacity. This is something that's being led by James and our friends over at the Community Foundation and the partnership with LISC. So this is really filling some of the same financial gaps that we were talking about that our CDCs and CHODOs face. Acquisition, pre-development, construction financing. This is a revolving loan pool that was created. They have $1 million that's going to revolve through our CDCs and CHODOs. They've also added a $1.5 million guarantee. Is that correct, James? To be able to guarantee 10% of these loans that are going to the CDCs. And what that does, it's going to stimulate lending to CDCs, and it's also going to be able to lower interest rates in some cases. So that, again, it's all about making these deals pencil out. Interest rates matter, so by using this tool, they can lower the interest rate for the borrower. And again, this is going to focus on single-family homes. And lastly, heirs property work. Our friend Christopher over here from LISC is leading this work in partnership with Three Rivers at this point in time, but it's also being supported by the United Way of Northeast Florida. And this is interesting. This work kind of got on our radar, what, about 3-4 months ago, even though they've been working on it for a while, but I didn't know the extent of the challenges that was here in Northeast Florida, right? So the purpose of heirs property is trying to clear titles and ownership from these properties that may have been handed down to a family member, but not officially transferred in a will or a legal document. So they're working on clearing titles of ownership. And also, I think this is an important point, protecting against tax deed sales, because investors can come in and pay the back taxes and property taxes on some of these properties where families don't even know maybe that they owe property taxes. And over a period of time, they can basically either take a portion of or ownership of that property. Christopher, correct me, I think I heard Pedro say this the other day. Northeast Florida has the greatest number of heirs property in the US. And just jumping down to the goal, successfully, if they're able to address this issue, it could unlock about $2.5 billion in home values. And again, this goes back to protecting the wealth of residents. So the big point of all this work that they're trying to push forward, addressing wealth loss, addressing property devaluation, displacement. So you'll see each one of these kind of be tied to one of the considerations up top. And this will be shared along with the MBA for anybody that's interested. But wanted to kind of share this with y'all, get everybody on the same page to understand what we are working on in 2023 collectively, who's doing some great work. There's a lot of other work that's being done, but these 4 efforts we feel tie directly to what the needs and information we've gotten through the CDFI friendly work, MVA over the last 8 years. So there's alignment across all of this. And this is just the 4 that we wanted to highlight today. And I think that's basically it. And again, this doesn't have anything to do with this meeting, but I always slide it in because I'm going to just make business cards and hand it out. But one of the issues that we have here, when you compare Jacksonville to other communities, is the flow of capital, right? It just doesn't move as easily as it does in some other communities. And I'm looking at Orlando, Miami, St. Pete, Tampa, those areas, everybody's on the same page. Absorption and deployment is on fire, right? Both sides of the equation are working. And this is just a quote that we always kind of put out there as a reminder, right? Capital flows where it's wanted and it's treated well. So if we want the capital and we want to treat it well, we need to be innovative, we need to be catalytic, and then that should open up the flow of capital here in Northeast Florida. So thank y'all for coming. Mari, I think you're going to close us out here. special thanks to the DuPont team who helped put the meeting on. Melanie, Lily, Colin, Katie, again, thank you. Who else am I missing? I think we're good. Maury, thanks.
Chris, and thank you, Katie, too, for having seen us all the way through to this third MVA. As many of you know, Katie, this is your last day of the Jessie Ball duPont Fund. She's not going far. She's just going to Baptist Health, just one floor down from here. So she's staying in the family, but this is your last hurrah. So, and Chris, thank you for sort of ably taking the baton from Katie and trying to make sure that we are transparent about what we are doing with this information. So it's my understanding that you'll all get the slide deck so you can get all that data. Your question about zip codes, hopefully we will get that additional overlay on top of the zip codes. And if you feel really strongly about additional overlays, you can come to us, but don't come to us with too many because otherwise we'll never get done with this MBA. But we will, of course, in 2 or 3 year time, revisit this data because obviously we're dealing with a very dynamic market and it's really important for us to stay on top of this. It's not something we can engage in every year because it involves a lot of work and literally driving block by block. So we'll take a pause, but come back to it when we are ready. Any last minute questions before I wrap this up? Well, anyone on Zoom who needs dying, burning question? No, doesn't look like there are any raised hands. So I'm going to thank you all for this intense interest and thank you also for the engagement that you gave us leading up to this meeting, because for those of you who literally joined Ira in the driving by the block by block, I so appreciate that engagement. I hope we can leverage it for future efforts. Thank you all.